All right. And probably give people maybe about a minute or two to join also. So we'll get started about 7:04.
Of course.
And I see people are flooding in. So as I just mentioned, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. As you're sort of getting situated, getting your Zoom station set up, as the case may be, getting a warm beverage or a cold beverage. It's a little cool out this evening. Just want to let you know we're going to get started about 7:03, 7:04. Just give people a chance to log on. And then we'll start with a short introduction and get on our way. And while I'm doing this sort of quick intro part two, I'll also mention that if you have questions, so you have the chat function, which is perfectly fine, but I would say if you want to put your questions into the Q&A, there's a little box on your Zoom controls that will let you do that. Lets you type in a question as they come up, and then we'll work through those as time allows over the course of the next hour or so. And thank you all for being here. We've got a really nice wide range of libraries, as I was just telling our author of note tonight, Jason. So it's very, it's really exciting to see people from both near and far. It's one of the great beauties of Zoom for sure. And see their count keeps going up, which is always a good sign. So I'm just going to wait till it's 7:04. We already have a question, which is amazing. Thank you. And I'll give one more plug before we get started with the introduction, which is if you have questions along the way, you of course can put them in the chat, which will go to both Jason and I, but ideally if you could put them in the Q&A function, that would be wonderful. It's a little bit easier to handle them all if they're all in one spot, and we can mark which ones are going to be answered live, that sort of thing, to keep track of where we are. So without further ado, it is 7:04, so let's get started. My name is Lauren Fender. I'm the coordinator of reference and public service at the Belmont Public Library. And thank you all so much for being here this evening. We are super excited to welcome Belmont native son and New York Times bestselling author Jason Gay back to talk about his newest book. I wouldn't do that if I were me. Modern Blunders and Modest Triumphs, but mostly blunders. If you don't have a copy, I would suggest grabbing one from the library or from your local bookstore. It's a hilarious and great read. And so basically, just a short overview of this. He takes a humorous and insightful look at life in the face of overwhelming societal change that we never anticipated, from the effects on parenthood, marriage, friendship, work, and play, to all other aspects of the strange lives we find ourselves living. And I think you'll speak a lot to that during this reading. So a little bit more about Jason. He is indeed from Belmont. We have had the amazing pleasure of having him here at the library, I want to say in 2016 or 2017. Yep. So that was, it's been a couple of years. Super glad to have him back. And he's always obviously writing. He is a sports and humor columnist at the Wall Street Journal. And as his bio states, he is very aware of how that sounds. In 2010, 2016, and 2019, Jason was named Sports Columnist of the Year by the Society of Professional Journalists. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Little Victories. If you haven't read it, please also check that out. It's a great book. And a finalist for the 2016 Thurber Prize in American Humor. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jason.
Thank you very much, Lauren. First of all, let me just begin by thanking Lauren for putting this event together and organizing it, not just with Belmont Public Library, but with a whole host of other neighboring libraries. I appreciate everyone's time tonight. I'm grateful for it. I know full well the value of a library. I spent quite a bit of time first in the lower floors as a children's library card holder at Belmont Public Library, and then later on moving upstairs to the big books, and I remember that very vividly. And so this library and all libraries and places that I've lived have played a really significant role in my life, and so I'm grateful to folks like Lauren and in particular Lauren here for putting this together. And last but not least, to my mother, who I am sure probably handcuffed herself to the front steps of the Belmont Public Library and asked for this event to be put on the schedule. She's a hard person to say no to, and I'm very grateful to her, to say the least. So I'm grateful to you, Mom. Thank you. It's funny, reading at book events have changed a little bit over time. The nature of them tends to be more of a question and answer kind of thing, as opposed to reading from books. All of us are familiar with the book reading where the author would come and they'd read for 10, 15 minutes or something like that. That's a little less common, especially in sort of our Zoom days. But the good news here is that I wrote quite a short book with pretty short chapters. So I'm going to read just one little excerpt from it to just give you a sense of the tone of this book, which is an extremely unserious book. And then we'll go from there. And I'm here to answer any questions you might have about sports, about my life in Belmont, about my mother and my mother's cat. Anything you want to ask me, I'm an open book. So I'm grateful again for everybody's time tonight. And so I'll go with this chapter. This is a chapter called Surrender Dad, because I am a surrender dad. My adult life is marked by moments of surrender. To family life, to the suburbs, to the carpool, to my undeniable uncoolness, to my bad haircuts and my scruffy, patchy beard, which looks as if it failed out of lumberjack school at least 3 times. I've surrendered to sugar, to carbohydrates, to 5 p.m. cocktails, and to 10 p.m. snacks. Unsurprisingly, because of this, I have surrendered to the drawstring. I realized that the other day that I have not purchased a pair of pants with a button in more than 2 years. I refuse to be defined by the widthocracy. My waist is not a size. It is an expression of me. Then there is Surrender Dad. Surrender Dad is a character I assume at least a few times per month when I have passed all point of parenting exasperation and control, and I simply must yield to whatever path is easiest and most convenient. Surrender Dad, it is not a parenting style you will read about in magazines or self-help books. He is not someone I brag about. Surrender Dad usually surfaces when Mom is out of town, and most often on Friday evenings after a long week at work. Surrender Dad does not fill me with vast amounts of pride, but he's very practical and comfortable. In fact, Surrender Dad is the drawstring pants of fatherhood. Surrender Dad, not surprisingly, is my children's absolute favorite dad. It's not even close. Well, why is he the kid's favorite? Well, Surrender Dad is chill. He's calm. He's relaxed. He's permissive. Surrender Dad, of course, has surrendered. He's the lazy father of your dreams. He's not going to hawkeye your activities and judge how much screen time you have. He's too tired, too overwhelmed. Hungry? Surrender Dad orders out. He not only orders out, but he orders pizza, not from the expensive place with the handmade whole wheat crust and the organic tomatoes, but from the horrible, terrible, delicious place that uses white flour and saturated fat and may or may not be staffed by rats who smoke Marlboro 100s. The nice organic pizza place, that takes about 80 to 90 minutes to arrive. Rat pizza, that can get to the door in about 9 minutes. Fake cheese still bubbling. Surrender Dad asks the kids, do you guys want wings with that? Of course we do, Surrender Dad. Why do you even ask? Make it 2 orders of wings. With Surrender Dad, dessert is straight from the carton. Surrender Dad doesn't care. And he's okay, not just with TV, but with screens of all kinds. Surrender Dad is not checking parental controls and search histories, and he's certainly not mulling over a PG-13 movie to find out exactly what is questionable content. Surrender Dad is friendly to Minecraft, to Roblox, to Super Mario, and all the characters in the Disney, DC, and Marvel universes. And honestly, he's okay if the kids watch a 20-minute video about bow hunting, if that's what it's going to take for Surrender Dad to get a little peace and quiet around the house. Because this is what Surrender Dad wants to do. He wants to surrender. He wants to collapse onto the couch, not to lie down, but to fall into it so hard that it makes a bodily impression. Surrender Dad wants to be free from 5 to 6, from 6 to 7, and from 7 p.m. until next Wednesday, surfacing only occasionally to freshen a drink or to answer the door for the pizza-carrying rats. Surrender Dad is not a conversationalist. He doesn't want any complicated questions about life and future. Surrender Dad is simply a docile Friday night rubber stamp of approval. You want to have friends over? Sure. Want to have 2 friends over? Sure. Want to have 3 friends over and play with knives and matches in your bedroom? With your door closed? Check, check, all of that. Surrender Dad isn't interested in any kind of parental patrolling. He doesn't want breathless reports from the field about who kicked who. Surrender Dad doesn't care who kicked who. Check with a box if you're still alive. Surrender Dad is going to get back to this college basketball game he's watching while finishing the last of these wings from the pizza rats. You know, I think more of us are surrender dads than we like to admit. Surrender moms, too. That's important. You know who you are. We are conditioned today to be super parents. You know what the type, with the fixated on quality time and meaningful connections with our children. Social media has made parenting feel comically performative. Look at this vacation I'm taking my kids on. Look at this tent that I've installed in the living room. Look at this water slide I built in the backyard from the bedroom to the garage. The takeaway is clear. If you do not have indoor camping Instagram adventures with your children, they're going to get on a wayward path, and they're probably going to end up as arsonists or NFL agents. You know, I'm as prone as any parent to falling into this paranoia. I want to be a super parent. I want my children to thrive, to have adventures and eat good things and have meaningful bonds. But some days, Dad just wants to look down at his phone and read an article on his phone. There used to be a word for surrender style parenting. It used to be called parenting. Not long ago, it was totally acceptable to be around your kids and not care what your kids were doing at every minute. You could even shoo them away like a farmer does with animals in the backyard. You didn't have to wait on your children and their favorite foods. You made your favorite foods and whatever was left in the fridge. And if your kids did not like it, you simply left them in the kitchen with the lights off for 2 days. Back then, there was a firewall of common sense between adult identity and parental identity. Back when your parents took you to a kids' movie about a talking squirrel, they didn't sit in a movie theater with you and watch 98 minutes of talking squirrel. They dumped you off. They went shopping and they came back and they hoped that they didn't accidentally leave you at the 2:45 screening of Altered States. If you wanted to sit on the couch and watch TV with your parents, they weren't hardly reaching for the remote and trying to find something you wanted to watch. Nope. You got stuck there with your dad watching a 2-hour documentary about battleships hosted by Tom Brokaw. Parents back then didn't obsess about playgroups and learning pods and the inner lives of random assortment of small people tracking through the kitchen. In olden times, parents barely bothered to learn the names of their children's friends. How's it going, Peter? Dad, that's Timmy. And yet, despite all these grotesque infractions, kids somehow made it to adulthood happy and intact. It's possible they even picked up a few self-sufficiencies along the way. And a few healthy self-sufficiencies in the process, and an understanding that they are not the center of the universe, and an ability to occupy themselves without constant entertainment and attention. My late father, bless him, was a parenting anachronism. When Friday turned to Saturday, I assure you his first consideration was not, hey, what do the kids want to do this weekend? He was like, what do I want to do this weekend? My dad did not look at my brother and I and think, what can I do to make these children's lives more fun? It turned out my father would think, why aren't these 2 children raking leaves? It turned out my father wanted to have children mainly because they would be an inexpensive landscaping crew. I think this is fine. I think this was good for me and my brother. Passive parenting, it's not your responsibility. It's a healthy tap on the brakes of obsessive modern parenting. There's too much pressure these days to accentuate every element of a child's life, to turn every moment into a potentially life-changing experience. That's why I'm okay with being a surrender dad. Surrender dad doesn't want a life-changing experience. He wants to find a decent movie on TV and pass out 20 minutes into it after he finishes the rat wings. And please return my hammer. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That's definitely one of my favorite. I mean, there's just so many essays in this collection that that I both either identified either as a child who was involved with a surrender dad, possibly, not to call out my father. I think he worked really hard, but there are those days, or just modern living. You know, there was just so many facets that you cover throughout, and each essay really is just a kernel of both hilarity and wisdom in its own right. So that was a great one to share.
Thank you.
So there's actually some questions already in the chat. So I always have a couple. Actually, I'm going to start with one of mine just because it sort of relates to
Okay.
one of the sort of threads that strings a lot of them together,
Right.
which is changes relative to COVID. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this was most of the essays were written during COVID sort of lockdown, or was that sort of the impetus?
They were either like during lockdown or kind of lockdown adjacent. So the idea sort of began during sort of serious lockdown, because my experience in writing about this, obviously this was a profoundly, disruptive experience and very painful for people. And, a lot of people experienced tremendous loss, heartbreak, serious stuff. However, society was changing in ways that were also kind of strange and comical and wondrous, and we learned a little bit about ourselves along the way. And every time that I wrote about this, keep in mind that I worked as a sports writer. So the first thing that happened in COVID, before almost anything else, was that sports stopped. There was nothing. There was basically, Russian sumo wrestling and dodgeball, and that was about it. So we were kind of out of work looking for stuff to write about. And so we were writing about these kinds of experiences. And I was struck by just the feeling of community that grew up around this. The reaction that I got from parents when I wrote about, virtual school, or just the sort of struggles around that. There were, for all the sort of, tumultuousness and genuine pain, there were also sort of feelings of just genuine community that I felt had been somewhat lacking, at least in my life before that. So I found that really compelling. This is a long-winded way of saying that I just felt there was something there to try to have some observations and treat with a little bit of light humor. Obviously we are coming out of a very serious stretch of history, a lot of grim stuff, a lot of things, to pick up the front page of, forget the journal, any newspaper is to be, pretty jarred by the stuff that's happening in our world, watching the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news. It's a pretty jarring time. And I think there is a place, and I'm trying to fill it for something a little lighter. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. One of the things that struck me, I can't remember which essay it is, but you sort of talk about how you had worked from home, before, for years before. So maybe this may be a little redundant based on what you just said, but how do you feel like the transition? I'm sort of interested in this transition where all of a sudden you were the person who was awake at 4 a.m. in that one essay, and you were always that person, but all of a sudden you were surrounded more often than not by people that your family and the family dynamic. Do you feel like that impacted your writing, not just the content, but also your process? Was it 3 o'clock because then all of a sudden you didn't have time at 4 o'clock because there were people who you live with, your family, who are around all the time, and now they're around even more?
Look, I had it quite easy compared to a lot of folks, and especially folks who, day one had to pick themselves up, put a mask on, and go into work, which there were a great many people, first responders and the like, who had to do stuff like that. So I had it very, very easy. But yeah, of course it was a challenge, disruptive, whatever you want to call it. I had to sort of wiggle my hours in between my kids. My wife is a school teacher. So in addition to having 2 young children who were taking virtual school, my wife was teaching virtual school in another room. So we had a full-blown schoolhouse in my small apartment for the first few months of this going on. And yeah, it did lead to these sort of nocturnal hours I had, or early morning. I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to write, which I grew to like. Now I find it, I can't believe there was a phase where I really did that day in and day out. It's harder for me to do that kind of waking up, for sure. But, a lot of people made life modifications. Obviously, I think there were things, again, my sacrifices were incredibly tiny compared to most people's. But, I think people had a new appreciation, I think, for their families, whether it's their occupations, the things that they were dealing with over the course of the day. Being a newspaper columnist is a little weird because, I'm not making anything that's very tactile for, somebody. I'm not sitting there, obviously, with a bandsaw, like making, a chair or something like that, I'm huddled over a computer, kind of mysteriously pecking away. So it's not as if my children gained any tremendous insight into what I was doing, but I feel very attached to them in ways that I probably hadn't been before, and certainly feel grateful to have had that bonding then.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The idea, it is interesting with intellectual work, how the fact, the effects, like you said, you're hunched over a computer. And I love how you mentioned that in a later essay, that this idea of, the hunching component and the work that goes into that, it's different. But
I would
also,
just, I would just correct you that there's nothing intellectual about what I do. It's like the opposite. It is like I describe it. It's sort of like, it's like painting a long fence. Just kind of a fence that never ends, and you just kind of paint one post at a time. And some posts are looking better than others, but yeah, it's more of a trial and error process than any kind of intellectual activity. But I appreciate the kind word.
well, I would say that if, for somebody who doesn't have a huge amount of space in one's brain for sports, I try really hard with baseball personally, and it doesn't always stick for me. I think there's a certain intellectual capacity that you gotta have in play there. It actually leads to a great segue for a less writing and more sports related question. One of the first ones that came in, which is, what do you think of the new rules or the new rule changes designed to speed up baseball? Super relevant. Thank you, Anne, for that question. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's a huge hit. And listen, I was the first person, raising my hand to make fun of baseball over the last bunch of years. Baseball has been a sport that I grew up with, probably you grew up with, a lot of people grew up with, as being sort of front and center, the national pastime, and really holding a big chunk of the sort of mind share of this country, only to watch it kind of whittle away over the last, generation and a half, and especially over the last like 10, 15 years, as games just became more and more prolonged, and the way and the type of style of play, which was sort of this analytics driven style of play, sort of depersonalized the game in ways that were concerning, and just it became kind of a slog. And anybody who had sat through, God bless them, those Red Sox Yankee games, they could sometimes go 4.5 hours, and having to sit through one of those things where you're on the couch from 7, you're looking at the clock, it's midnight. That's not sustainable. And I think baseball was stubborn about it for a long time, but finally acknowledged that they did have this problem. And in doing this pitch clock, which was something that they had tried out in minor league ball, they tried it out in instructional league first, winter ball first. I mean, it is probably the most revolutionary thing that has happened in sports, in sort of a big U.S. major sport in the 21st century. I mean, you really have to go back to things like the introduction of the shot clock, moving this, the forward pass, moving the end zones in the NFL. I mean, like, a real structural change to the way the game works, but also something that is, by and large, a huge boon for the sport, something that is getting more people excited about it. Some of the funny things that have come up already in this time, I mean, we're talking about, we've had 4 weeks of baseball. This is not, we don't have a year's worth of evidence here, but the early returns are good. 2 things that I think are kind of funny. It's one, fans are sticking around later at games. I think any of us who have been to a baseball game in the last bunch of years, you would look at your watch, come 7th, 8th inning, and you'd be shocked. You'd sit there and say, oh gosh, it's 10:45 already. It's halfway through the 6th inning. What am I going to do? Now people can stay for the whole game. And that's a wonderful thing. Just puts more energy in the park. The other thing is that people can do other stuff. You can make a dinner plan after a ball game. That's an afternoon game maybe, or you can tell a babysitter that you'll be home by X amount of hours. I mean, honestly, I think that these changes are radically good for the game. And the surprising thing is, nobody's better about complaining about things in sports than the athletes themselves, the people who are actually put on the field. They're not complaining that much. I mean, they have stray complaints here and there. And I guarantee you, there's going to be some moment in the playoffs where someone gets called for a violation on an important strike, or a batter gets called for a violation, and it'll be a big, big fuss. But unquestionably, I think it's been a positive development.
Yeah, something that was interesting, my husband had mentioned that they're also changing when the last call is, right? That's historically been the 7th inning stretches for you're getting your last beer.
Alcohol, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that was another interesting side effect, like you said, talking about the other effects, what it frees you up to do, but then also changes your experience of the game, so in terms of the economics of the beer sales, for example, it's just one of those sort of side effects you might not necessarily anticipate, but it kind of makes sense. And I would say it maybe makes the game more, it makes it more enjoyable overall, not because of the beer sales necessarily, but because it's you're enjoying it. It doesn't feel like a slog at the end.
I mean, I think they have pulled off this neat trick of actually accelerating pace without really changing the integrity of the game. I mean, this is not something where they've decided that all of a sudden they're going to have 3 outs to 2 outs and 4 balls is going to be 3 balls, and that's the way to speed it up. They had talked about all kinds of things, making games 7 innings. They did do that briefly during COVID. I think that this is a recognizable game still, but I think it's a sort of got a shot of espresso from Duncan, and it's moving along quite a bit better.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. We'll stick on the baseball related topic because somebody else chimed in with what other baseball rules would you like to see changed, which I felt was relevant here.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things that they will look at the end of this year is obviously, net effect on, the other changes that have happened, of course, are things like, you have a permanent designated hitter now. There's no pitcher hitting in the National League. You have these changes to pickoffs where pitchers can only throw down to first base 2 times. After that, they got to stop, which is designed to, make people steal bases a little bit more. They've made the bases themselves a little bit bigger, which is a safety issue primarily because they hate the idea of people smashing their feet together on a close play. And then most importantly, they have outlawed the dramatic shift. Anybody who's been to a ball game in the last bunch of years was familiar with the sort of analytic driven shifts that you would see where the whole outfield was crowded full of people because they knew that this hitter had just a dead-on tendency to hit to this part of the field and really couldn't hit to the other part of the field. Basically, they have tried to use rules to game the system to return the sport to what it was when most of us were young. A sport where players would hit to all fields, where they would steal bases, where they would play quote-unquote small ball, trying to generate runs cleverly as opposed to just dramatically hitting home runs and that kind of, all or nothing kind of style of play, which proliferated in the last bunch of years. Again, there's some artifice to it, right? I know that if you're hardcore, you'd probably say, I don't need no shift rules, like just learn to hit to the opposite field. The fact of the matter is that would have taken a lot more time than this, and putting these rules into place to accelerate the changes that baseball wanted was really important. The change that I hear murmured about that I'm very curious to see if it will happen, and has not taken place in any sort of instructional or minor league setting, but does get talked about, is the idea of some kind of scenario in which you would be able to bring your best player to plate in the 9th inning or in some sort of dramatic circumstance. You get sort of like a hall pass to like bring up your best player. So say, we're talking about peak Red Sox season. So you could bring David Ortiz, even if David Ortiz had hit the inning before. If it's the 9th inning, there are 2 outs and there are 2 on, and you want David Ortiz to come to the plate, you would get like 1 pass per game to be able to do that kind of thing. The reason why baseball talks about this quietly is that one advantage that other sports have over something like baseball is that the great players are going to be there at the end. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are on the court for the end of a Celtics game. In a Bruins game, your best players are on the ice in the critical moments. In a football game, Tom Brady is playing quarterback for the critical game-winning drive. Baseball, just by the nature of the way baseball works, you're not necessarily seeing the most box office, most exciting players in the final part of that game. And so that is a very radical change. I mean, that is the kind of thing that I think some purists will have a real problem with, because you're really kind of messing with the original version. But that is something that is going to be, come up, I think, in frequency, because driving all of this, we have to be honest, is that, this is financially driven. That these sports, by and large, are supported nowadays by television income. So the revenue that they are getting from selling TV rights to their product And if they are not generating the kinds of ratings and returns for their network partners, that number is going to get smaller and smaller. So they have to make sure that they are doing things that turn the number in the right direction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's always a numbers game, no matter no matter how you look at it.
Yeah.
So I know there's another sports question, but we're sort of talking a lot about baseball, which makes it, and you've mentioned a number of Boston related teams, which is perfectly fair, knowing that you grew up in this area. But do you have, other than golf, obviously, do you have a favorite sport, or would you, and sort of a secondary question, I guess, is, do you have favorite teams in major sports, or as a sports columnist, do you sort of not have a like team allegiance because you're more interested in the game as a whole and the dynamics? And you mentioned the Mavs Pelicans in one of the essays in here too, which I thought was an interesting reference, because they wouldn't necessarily have been the teams that I figure as a sports writer you would be interested in watching it, but as a, let's say, a Celtics fan, is that really what you're where you would be leaning, I guess?
Yeah.
So sort of
I
a
mean,
two-parter.
sure. I mean, let's start with the sort of back half of the question first, which is that I'm shameless. I root for the best possible story. So whatever is, whatever athlete of the moment, whatever team of the moment is sort of the most interesting, is the most compelling thing to have happen. I think that's the thing that I root for. Whatever is sort of the best, juiciest, most exciting, gets the most people riled up story. That's the story that I would like to see happen. Now, I have no control over that, obviously, but I like sort of like surprises and disruptions and upsets and Cinderellas and all that kind of stuff. I will always root for the underdog. I will always root for sort of somebody who's been waiting a very, very long time to reach that sort of ultimate stage. Those are the things that get me excited, and I'm pretty neutral on where it's coming from and what cities it's coming from. I probably have a tiny bit of myself that is always a little bit suspicious of New York, even though I lived in New York for many, many, many years. There was a part of me that could never get excited about the Yankees. I just couldn't do it no matter what. I always felt, the Yankees won a few World Series when I was there, and they just sort of felt like real estate closings. They just kind of expected them to happen, and then they happened, and they just kind of went back to their business. Whereas what happened with the Red Sox, these were things that also happened when I was in New York, including 2004, was much more seismic and soul, changing, and just a whole different kind of emotional arc than what happened with New York. But in terms of other sports, some folks who might know my family know that my father was the tennis coach for Cambridge Ridge and Latin High School for 40 years. And he, developed in me at an early age a real love of tennis, watching, Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe, Jimmy Connors, on the grainy television live from Wimbledon, 9 o'clock in the morning in July with the house, 95 degrees inside, and watching that, and Bud Collins in his loud pants, and just that whole experience. And, I grew up with a racket in my hand because my father was always playing, played a lot as a kid, loved the sport, loved the characters around that. I mean, that was kind of a funny thing because men's tennis in that time, and even women's tennis too, because that was a very dynamic period for women's tennis. Just a lot going on, a lot of exciting sort of people who are, still remain legends of the game. Again, McEnroe, Borg, Becker, Connors, Martina, Chrissy Evert. These were seismic figures. And then you sort of come to the period of time where I got to enter the world as a reporter. Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, Serena Williams, Maria Sharapova, Coco Gauff, all these young players who are coming up, all this like fun stuff that is happening in the world of tennis, all of a sudden sort of feels like a bookend, right? And getting to visit these places that for me were just little boxes that I saw on television, whether it's, Wimbledon or the French Open or something, things that just sort of felt like magical to me as a kid, and getting to walk in the gates of them and see what they were actually like, and having them, they really are kind of extraordinary. It's very moving, to have that kind of experience. And so I love the sport, but I definitely feel like part of the reason I love it is that I just had the real luck of being around at a time when, again, these sort of legendary figures, this is like watching Godzilla and King Kong. We don't know if we're going to see these monsters ever again. They're so good and so important for the sport. And I've tried to appreciate every minute of that.
Yeah, no, that's perfect segue. Actually, there was a two-parter. I'll start with the comment from Keith here, which is loves the T2000 racket on the wall behind you. So a great tie into tennis, obviously.
Yeah, and that's on the money, Keith. Good eye. That is, in fact, a Jimmy Connors Wilson T2000. I can't attest to how it's strung, but that is like basically playing with a frying pan compared to what modern technology is today with strings and composite rackets. I look at that racket and I hold it in my hand and I say, somebody won Wimbledon and US Open with this racket. So anything is possible. I mean, because this thing, I can't believe anyone hit it, much less won championships with it.
Well, it makes for beautiful wall art also for what it's worth. So there's maybe a twofold component. And Keith's question from earlier on, which we'll circle back to, and switching sports actually a little bit. What are your thoughts about the quote grumpy lobster boat captain hanging around to break Shula's record with the Patriots? Big WSJ fan. This is again from Keith.
Well, thank you, Keith. Listen, that's another experience where I kind of got to see the whole arc, right? Because I'm old enough to remember Schaefer Stadium, aluminum seats, 2 and 14, Victor Kayam, Don McPherson, possibly moving to St. Louis, possibly moving to Connecticut, all the sort of dog days of this franchise, and then get to live through this incredible renaissance and this dynasty of the 21st century. And then now we're seeing, I wouldn't say it's not going back to the days of aluminum seats at Schaefer Stadium, but certainly less competitive product than we've seen in the first 20 some odd years of the century. I just feel like Belichick is always a more attractive alternative to what you could get instead. So I think that if you start from that standpoint as the Patriots, if you're just sort of evaluating year in and year out, he's just going to, on paper, be a much more attractive choice than anybody you could bring in. I mean, really, what name could you bring in? You say like, well, could it be like Sean McVay? If Sean McVay could come into the Patriots, would you make that move right now? Now, I'm sure there were people who would, but you're talking about inarguably the greatest of all time versus somebody that we don't know, won a Super Bowl, nice coach, no question about it. But that's a tough choice to make. In terms of Belichick's wanting to stay in the sport, I do agree with what you said with regard to the Shula record, that he is very attuned to history. He's somebody who considers himself, kind of a scholar of the game, and has a repertoire or knowledge of the sport that very few people who compete in it do, and can tick off players who were playing in leather helmets without face guards, and I think has a real respect for those numbers and things. So I think he's acutely aware of that number and being able to get there. I don't think he's the kind of person that would just hang around, and certainly not like bounce from team to team chasing a number. But I think with it, as long as it's in view, I think it has appeal for sure.
Well, I'll give another quick plug here. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to enter them in the chat, tennis T2000 related or otherwise. And while people are sort of thinking, I'm just going to throw out some, and we're switching gears kind of a little bit back to, as a librarian, the more writerly components of the collection of essays. So I think personally, what I really love about your writing is, and maybe I'm just I'm an easy mark, maybe, I don't know. I think there's some truth to that, because I do enjoy to laugh, but I would also say that there were so many times while reading this collection of essays where, I was laughing out loud. And I don't think personally, I don't find that to be an easy task. I don't think humor writing is easy. Obviously, some people will find somebody more or less funny depending on their tastes, and everyone's got their niche, but I feel like you hit a really wide variety. Did you come to writing in humor first because you have it seems to me almost a natural knack for it, or did you start in sports writing? What was sort of apologies if this is asking you to sort of recap your writing background, but sort of how did you end up in humor writing, I guess, is my question, or was it sports first?
No, I grew up always, liking funny writers and funny columnists and people like telling jokes in newspapers. I always sort of got a kick out of that because it felt like a little bit sort of like talking during class. Like newspapers to me, felt like serious product with serious people and serious news. And so anytime you kind of laughed at a newspaper, I was drawn to that. when I got started in newspapers, my training was very, typical. It was, the who, what, when, where, and why, and they weren't interested in jokes from me at all. It was definitely very sort of, I wouldn't say formulaic, but sort of the very, sort of classic training of news writing, which is to give people the information without fear or favor, and spell everybody's name right, and focus on that, getting the names and the facts straight. As I got older and moved from place to place and wrote for places with a little more voice, and we're able to sort of bring a little bit of myself into it more, yeah, I would say that my tendency is a little bit more lighthearted. I'm not somebody who is terribly comfortable feeling stern and severe. Even when I do feel angry about something, I try to have a little bit of a light touch. There's a lot to be angry about in the world right now. No question about it. I'm not somebody who like wakes up and is like, wow, everything's great and funny. Like, there's definitely a lot of painful stuff. But even on those occasions, I find that there's real value in kind of presenting it through a little bit of a lighter lens. And it's trial and error. Some of them work, some of them people really respond to, some of them people do not respond to. You have editors who like it, editors who don't. I've been very fortunate to have editors who have been really supportive at the Journal. But I would be fooling myself to think that I'm any better than what I wrote last. You just kind of write one, becomes birdcage liner that day, and then it becomes digital birdcage liner at first, and then it becomes print liner, because we still print a paper, thankfully. But you just are only as good as your last one, and that is both the pleasure of the job, because when you don't do a good one, you get a chance to get right back up there and try again, but also the challenge, because a lot of people like to they're very, very good about writing one, but then having to sort of get up off the couch and do it again and again and again. That's not for everybody. And I feel like I got into this job at the right time. I had great bosses, had enough experience that, and also just didn't know anything about the Journal. I was somebody who, I knew what the Wall Street Journal was. I knew what it sort of stood for, as this sort of, very august financial newspaper, but I didn't read it. And if I knew a lot about it, I probably would have freaked out and had a heart attack and not been able to, do the job. So I was blissfully ignorant of the platform they had given me, but it's been nothing less than the best job I've ever had. It's an absolute pleasure, the relationship with the readers. And I really do feel strongly that it's a relationship, because, if you follow the way that newspapers support themselves now, we are effectively at the service of our readers. Our readers are the ones who are, paying the bills, keeping the lights on, giving us guidance in terms of stuff that they're interested in, the stuff they're not interested in, which is not to say that, I have to agree, we have to agree all the time on everything, but I am so appreciative of that sort of two-way traffic with readers of the paper who, keep me on my toes constantly and give me ideas. There was a story I wrote a couple of weeks ago at the Journal about a young man who was a remarkable college athlete who played college lacrosse in Pennsylvania, who had had a heart transplant just 18 months prior, and was back playing college lacrosse. This has never happened in the history of contact sports, that someone had had a heart transplant at that age and come back and played, a collision sport like lacrosse. That story idea came from a reader, a friend of a friend said, I know this story about and I've not worked at places that kind of relationship existed. So I'm very, very grateful to people who read the columns, read the books, take the time to let me know what they think, positive or negatively. I'm game for all of it.
That's a fascinating story. And it's also interesting. It reminds me of an interview that David Sedaris had, and he had a very similar relationship. And obviously he writes humor as well, and a lot of essays also. And that was oftentimes where he gets his inspiration from. In the interview I'm thinking of, I think it was on probably 60 Minutes or something, he was at a book signing, and there was an individual who he made a comment, and he said about something about monkeys, or it smelled like bananas. And it turned out that the lady who he was signing the book for had been training monkeys for a specific reason. So she said, can you smell it on me? Right. And then it led to this thread, this conversation, which ends up being an essay later on. So yeah, I mean, that definitely speaks to that. And I guess maybe that's an interesting segue too. I mean, I think, again, to speak to humor writing as well as sports, like you really do find your own voice. But are there any writers that you, past or present, that you take inspiration from, or do you feel like it's been, since it is so much, you're just as good as the last piece that you wrote, it sort of helped you define your own voice?
Oh no, for sure. There are lots of people I love reading, and I find people all the time that are new and exciting, and I want to sort of borrow from. I mean, I feel like writing is a little bit like music in that you, whether you're conscious of not, if you read somebody that you like and you sort of start to appropriate like things, and to be very, very clear, I'm not talking about like plagiarizing and lifting language and stuff like that, but like we're all kind of like a stylistic accumulation of all the things that we liked and read and responded to when we were younger, and or what we're doing now. And I can think of people that I read growing up, whether it's somebody like a Lee Montville or Bob Ryan or Jai McMullen, Dan Shaughnessy, these people in the Boston Globe, sort of this incredible group of columnists, all of whom shaped what I did and do. And there's always new people that I hadn't learned about. Somebody that I read a lot, when I got this job, I guess I've been doing it for about 12 years. I really went back and read everything I could from sort of a lot of the greats, quote unquote. And people like Jim Murray, who wrote with the Los Angeles Times for many years. Red Smith, who was the great columnist for the New York Times and other places, the New York Herald Tribune, and read everything they wrote, or everything they wrote that I could get my hands on. And, one of the things that struck me about all of them is that they had a degree of humility. They weren't sort of like writing on the page, like, I know everything, this is how it is, and everybody else is wrong besides me. They knew that they were kind of writing a first draft of whatever version of, event that they were at, whatever sort of commentary they were giving to a particular moment. You have to have a little bit of humility of the fact that, like, you're going to be wrong. You might not have the most fully formed opinion about everything. You do have to be sort of honest and true to yourself. And so I like those kinds of writers. Sedaris is somebody like that. It has an enormous sense of like self and humility and just shamelessness. And I mean that in a very complimentary way. He obviously is shaped, as am I, by somebody like Nora Ephron, who was a tremendous humor writer and had the phrase that I think of often, which is that everything is material. My children come home and they tell me some ridiculous story from school, and I'm like saying like, oh, how am I going to like steal that and put it in, like everything is material. If someone had told me the value that children provide to a columnist, I would have had them much, much earlier, because they are just a constant content machine. But writers like that, and again, there are new ones and people who come up all the time, and there are people at the Journal who are, getting going as columnists who I'm inspired by too. So I try not to be closed-minded about any of it.
Yeah, no, that's a great life lesson. I mean, that's some great life material right there too. So well said. We'll see if we can get to the last three that just sort of came in the last couple of minutes here. We'll start circling back on baseball. If they had used the DH in the 1910 to 1920 period, do you think that we would ever have known the other talents of that excellent Red Sox pitcher, George Ruth? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a funny question. Well, I think, Barbara, not to be overly literal, I know what you're trying to say, and it's a fun point because yes, somebody like Babe Ruth had skills in multiple things, but we are actually living in the current moment of the closest approximation to Babe Ruth we have ever seen in Shohei Ohtani, who plays for the Los Angeles Angels, that I'm sure you're aware of, and is playing in the era of the DH, plays the field in addition to being a pitcher, is outstanding at both of them, and in some ways is Ruth's statistical superior already. He's not anywhere near 700 home runs, but he's been doing it longer than Ruth has. Ruth only pitched for, I believe, a couple of seasons before he moved over to being a position player full time. In terms of like whether or not DHs would prevent the discovery of great pitching hitters, the truth of the matter is that players come up through systems and colleges and leagues and so on. And so their talents, by the time they get to the big leagues, are pretty well known. They're not going to be like all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, I never knew that guy could hit. They know. So I don't think that you are limiting the possibility of another Babe Ruth coming along by having this DH rule, but it's a fun question and I appreciate it.
All right. So we'll start with maybe a shorter segue, and then we'll close out with the larger sports one, which is, do you play Thanksgiving football with your family? Love those games.
This year, I played no Thanksgiving football with my family because I was in Doha, Qatar for the World Cup.
Oh,
Very strangely was, in the end of November and early December this year, halfway across the world. And I miss my family. I miss Thanksgiving. We had a little micro Thanksgiving in Qatar, but we didn't play football because we had to go to soccer games. But I love that tradition, that began, as something that the first one I wrote, I honestly wrote because I had to go to a touch football game. So I had to write a column. I had a deadline. And I was like, I got nothing here. I'm just going to write some rules about touch football on Thanksgiving. And it was a kind of a get out of town excuse column. And then, lo and behold, it became something people shared or had ideas and opinions about. And it was a lot of fun. And so it's continued on since then. My family and I have since moved to Maryland, and my wife's family has a very large touch football game on Thanksgiving. In fact, there are two touch football games. There's one big family one that takes all comers. And then there's one very serious one that I'm not invited to because I'm not good enough. So, there's a few options to choose from. But yeah, that, when I was talking earlier about journal readers and that relationship, I mean, people send me pictures of their families, the scores, who made the winning plays, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's such a pleasure. Love it.
too funny. Keith comments quickly, crab cakes and football can't go wrong with Maryland.
And lacrosse, that's about it, Keith. Yeah.
All right. And we'll finish out with this last question, which was just a great question from Joe. If you were to write a sports biography next, who would you want to be the subject?
Oh, it's so interesting. I've had conversations in my head about like that idea and like what would be a modern athlete that I would love to write. I think that, Roger Federer is somebody that, were he to write his autobiography and he was looking for somebody to ghostwrite it, I would raise my hand immediately at that possibility just because he's never done anything like that before, and be able to get inside his head for things that a lot of it I got to eyewitness would be really, really fun to do. Sports biographies are a funny business nowadays because, as the reading population and especially the book buying population ages, the books that tend to get people excited usually are athletes who are long ago retired. So people are more interested in a biography of Ted Williams than they would be about Derek Jeter, for example, because Ted Williams has been long since retired, has this wide historical record, and Derek Jeter is somebody who we've all kind of been, surrounded by with Derek Jeter stuff for a million years. How much interest would there be in reading more about that? So that's kind of like the riddle, is to find somebody who people are going to be, persuasively interested in for, several hundred pages. So that's a question that I continue to think about. Sometimes I think it's somebody that people haven't heard about. It's somebody who was a mover and shaker who might have been underappreciated or unseen or did it so long ago that everybody's kind of forgotten about it, who played a vital role in sports, whether it's men's sports, women's sports, leagues, the way that we watch sports, that kind of stuff. I read a book not terribly long ago. It was a biography, an autobiography of Roone Arledge, who is the creator of ABC's Wide World of Sports. And this is somebody who is, big television executive, and yet had as profound a, impact on the shaping of the way that we view sports and process sports in this century as anybody. And, so sometimes the sport, the good ones come out of you from different ways. So I'm open to all of it. If you have ideas, please let me know.
Send them into the journal if you can. Let's build those relationships a little bit more. No, that's a great point. All right. Well, I think we are out of some really excellent questions. There's a little bit of love coming in the chat here too. So great interview. So thank you so much, Jason. Great interview. Absolutely. I really appreciate your time. Thank you also all the partnering libraries. We are joined by people from Andover, or library patrons from Andover, Ashland, Danvers, Franklin, Nashua, New Hampshire, which is really nice to see somebody from out of state joining us. Again, speaking to the power of Zoom, for better or for worse. Norwood, Wayland, and Woburn, and of course, all of the Belmont participants who are with us this evening.
You sound like
Uh,
you're reciting the snow cancellations, for tomorrow. And
Yeah.
Ashland,
Right.
no
Well,
school.
right. It is interesting how it sort of forms a belt, right, around the larger Boston area. We've got Norwood to the south, Franklin to the southwest. I think Ashland's out there, and then we got a lot north in the Noble area, as we like to call it in library land. But thank you all so much for being here. Joe also puts in the chat, thank you for both for your time and your great writing. And I'll just give another plug. I did put a link in there too. If you go to bookshop.org, it'll let you choose the local bookshop if you have one. In Belmont, it happens to be Belmont Books, where they're a great partner for us, to pick up your copy of I Wouldn't Do That If I Were Me, which is Jason's newest book. And obviously you can catch him writing for the journal on a regular basis. We have it here at the library, and we also have an online subscription, so you can never be too far from reading more of Jason's hilarious and insightful comments. So thank you so much, Jason, for your time. Really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the night.
Lauren, thank you very, very much for all your hard work in putting this together. And thank you to everybody, to Mom for helping organize and rally some viewers, I'm sure. So thank you all and have a wonderful week.
All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a
Bye.
great rest of the night. All right. Bye-bye.